Jim and Elise, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here.
Great. Well, why don't we start off with you telling us about your backgrounds, sort of your history, where you came from, and how you got to be where you are today. Jim, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go over to Elise.
Great. Well, Matt, thank you so much for inviting us to participate. I'm the director of the Levin Center, and my background really that informs what I do is my experience serving earlier in my career as a congressional staff person. I worked in Washington, D.C. for almost 6 years as a legislative staffer. I was legislative director for Congresswoman Nita Lowey and worked on a number of committees, including the House Appropriations Committee, doing oversight work and other kinds of investigative work, along with a lot of other legislative work. And then later, more recently in my career, I have actually served as an elected member of the Michigan House of Representatives, where I was the ranking Democrat on the Oversight Committee. And in between those times, I have spent a lot of time in the private sector, practicing law, as well as working in industry, in the auto industry, and running a couple of different nonprofits. So I've been on both sides of this equation. I've been an investigator and somebody engaged in oversight, and I've also been representing clients and doing other work where oversight has been part of the equation.
Thank you. Elise?
So for my part, I started off when I was in college. I took a semester off and worked for the House of Representatives for Joe Moakley. Got the bug, but left and went to law school. Then clerked for a judge, worked for the Department of Justice in the civil fraud section for a couple years, and then went back up on the Hill working for Senator Carl Levin from Michigan. Worked for him for nearly 30 years doing investigations, including serving as a staff director and chief counsel on the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which is a big oversight outfit in Congress. When he retired in 2015, I did as well, and helped set up the Levin Center in his honor. It's at Wayne State University Law School in Detroit, which is Senator Levin's hometown.
Great. And so both of you have really practitioners' backgrounds, right? Either on staffs or, actively representing. So it's not quite the typical kind of research background for a think tank or a university scholar, but maybe you could explain a little bit, broad speaking, what are your interests in terms of research? Do you have, kind of broad questions or broad issues that you're looking at, and what's the scope of that interest?
Well, maybe I'll kick it off, and then Elise, I'll turn it over to you, because you've been doing a great deal of work working to build up the field of scholarship in the oversight area. I would say, Matt, just as a sort of framework for understanding what the Levin Center does, we look at both academic scholarly research, as well as what I would say is more applied research. So our areas of interest really look to understanding, the constitutional basis for oversight. Why is oversight a power of our legislative bodies, whether that's Congress or the state legislatures? How does it work? How effective is it? How can it be made to work better? Sort of academic questions in that space. But we are also interested in more applied research, scanning the horizon around the country, looking at how oversight is being conducted and whether it's really meeting the needs of our country, and are there ways in which it can be done better. So we are looking constantly at the way oversight's being conducted and trying to find better ways and holding up best practices and leaders who are doing a good job.
So before we go into the details of defining oversight and getting into an understanding of it from a federal and a state point of view, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Senator Levin and why has this institute come about and a little bit of its history.
Elise, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience with Senator Levin and some of the things that he's done, that he did that really inspired the Levin Center?
Sure. So as I said, I worked for Senate 11 for 30 years on different subcommittees doing different kinds of investigations. We looked at both things that the government was doing and also what the private sector was doing. And today, because of that, we do a lot of training as well with congressional staff and even state legislators and some other members of Congress. To just give you an example, a number of years ago, we kept hearing about abuses in the credit card industry. And Senator Levin asked us to look into it. We ended up doing a year-long investigation. We had some hearings. We ended up passing legislation, the Credit Card Act, in 2009. We made a lot of changes. For just to give you a couple examples, credit card companies used to charge interest on debt that you'd already paid. Like, how is that possible? They used to hike interest rates on people that they felt were more risky, even though those people had been paying their bills on time in compliance with all the rules. So the bill changed that, stopped a lot of abuses. When the investigation was over, I ran into one of the bank lobbyists that I'd been sort of on the other side of, and he said, well, gee, Elise, you know, how's it going here? I said, I hear there really aren't too many abuses anymore. And he said, well, you know what? We're still making money. And that's really a good oversight investigation where you get rid of the abuses, but not the industry itself, because we all need credit cards, we all need credit. So that's the kind of constructive oversight that Congress can do. We did it on a bipartisan basis. We really paid attention to the facts. And that's the kind of thing that Senator Levin has inspired with the Levin Center at Wayne Law, which is all about trying to create fact-based, bipartisan, high-quality oversight investigations. And Senator Levin used to say, you want good government, you need good oversight.
Well, I think that leads to then the question about the definition of oversight, because what you mentioned there is really almost industrial oversight in a sense, right? And it's not oversight of the executive branch, which is, I think, what's often referred to as oversight. So could you explain to us a little bit, you know, your view in defining oversight and how it kind of connects with Congress's overall mandate?
Maybe let me offer a framework or a way of thinking about oversight that might be useful. Oversight can kind of come in two very basic forms. There is what I would call routine oversight, and it might be oversight of industry, it might be oversight of the executive branch's performance and caring, you know, faithfully executing the law, but it's done on a routine basis. It's a little bit analogous to what you might imagine the police force doing, right? The police are patrolling our neighborhoods to make sure that nothing bad happens or to respond to bad things that do happen. The other kind of oversight is more oversight that is in response to a crisis or a scandal that is, that comes to the attention of Congress, let's say. And that oversight is focused on dealing with a specific, set of circumstances. Wildfires in California, for example, or maybe the poisoning of a water supply in an American city. Those are crises that deserve focused and in-depth investigation. And the point is really more broadly is that in both cases, what we want is in-depth and fact-finding that is not captive to partisan interests. Because, as we like to say, facts are not blue, they're not red, they're just facts. And those facts are what should inform our pursuit of the truth.
So when we talk about the investigations, can you talk a little bit about how Congress goes about doing these investigations and how does it organize itself? And, obviously the makeup of the investigative group can be partisan or not partisan. Can you explain a little bit in more detail how that actually happens and what are the factors that lead to, the probability of success of those investigations?
So I'll take a first shot at that. We actually have a law that requires every committee in Congress to conduct oversight within their area of jurisdiction. So for example, the Banking Committee is required to look at a whole range of banking and financial issues. The Agriculture Committee is looking at farming stuff, farm credit, food safety, a whole range of issues there. So that's by law. So every committee has an oversight obligation. Some committees are more bipartisan than others. That can be a function of their rule, their traditions, what members are on the committee. It can also be a function of what issues come up during that year. The whole, because committees only have a limited amount of time and attention to spend on this stuff, one of the key questions is, well, what are we going to investigate? And what committees typically do is they draw up an agenda at the beginning of the year. Certainly Senator Levin did that. And we would identify 1, 2, 3, maybe as many as 5 different issues we would try to focus on that year. And then it depends on how much time the committee wants to give to a particular topic. They may give you 2 weeks. They could give you 2 months. They can give you 2 years to do that investigation. And then you design an investigative plan and response.
And so that investigative team, if you will, who is it composed of? What types of people? Is it mainly staffers? Are there specific staffers who are focused on only this type of work? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So most, it's done by staff, congressional staff. The staffs are very small, typically. There are some committees that are pretty large, but you might have 1 to 3 people working on an investigation. Sometimes they're very junior people. As you may know, the staff in Congress has an average tenure is 4 years. These are often people who have just graduated from college and it's their first or second job. A lot of inexperienced people. That's in part because the pay is so low. It's an exciting job. We get very terrific people, but a lot of people don't stay for very long. I was in that small cadre of 1 to 2 to 3% of the career of people that make it a career. And so hopefully with those more junior people doing the investigation, you have a more senior person, a staff director or a counsel or somebody like that, that's overseeing their work on a day-to-day basis. And then they report to usually to the chairman or the ranking member on the subcommittee or committee. Some members of Congress actually have investigative people or teams within their personal office, and they would report to their staff director or chief of staff. So that's sort of how it works, but it's a very small group of people working on any particular investigation.
And are the staffers, allocated according to party, or is it, is it bipartisan, these types of teams?
I'll just mention that it depends on the committee. So for example, on Armed Services Committee, they often have joint teams that work for both sides. But other committees, they have staff allocated. The majority has their staff, and the minority, which has less money, has a much smaller staff. And for example, on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, we would have more people from the majority staff, but we would always ask the minority to participate as well. So that just depends on the committee, the subcommittee, their traditions and rules.
Right. And
I would just add, Matt, I would just add that, one of the things that's really governing here, really important, are the relationships that have been built by both the members, the chair and the ranking, minority member, and the staff. And so, the leaders of these committees set a tone, and Senator Levin, very much during his career, set a tone when he was chair to build relationships and to deal fairly with his counterparts on the other side of the aisle. And that reaped great dividends for these investigations over the years, because it meant that both parties, staff and members, from both parties, were providing input and their perspectives to these investigations. And what came out of that were very in-depth and very impactful investigations.
If I can just mention one last thing about that is, the reason Senator Levin liked that so much is he found that people who investigate, where the investigators don't all have the same mindset, that some of the people have fundamentally different worldviews, you tend to look at more facts, you interpret them differently, you challenge each other, and the results in terms of the facts are they're usually more accurate, they're more thorough, they're more thoughtful, and of course they're more credible.
So in terms of the investigation team's time, can you walk me through a little bit about how an investigation would progress over time? Is most of the energy spent collecting facts, secondarily, or is it mainly interviews? Is it informal, or is it formal hearings? How does it really work when an investigation is done?
So I'll take that one again, since that's what I did my whole career. First thing you do is you get your direction from your boss. Second thing you would do is you would have a brainstorming session and you say, how do we want to frame this issue? If we're asked to look at the financial crisis, well, what does that mean? What are we actually going to do? When you frame, and we tried to frame it as a factual question, not like a science experiment where you have a hypothesis and you're going to prove it, because that warps everything, but instead an open-ended factual question. You then design an investigative plan that involves getting briefings from experts, then requesting documents, reviewing those documents, then talking to, interviewing people who actually know firsthand what happened, and developing your theory of what happened, writing it up, and then if it's important enough, having a hearing as well.
And so would you say when you do the hearings, would you say that that's, 10% of the time, 5%? Is the vast majority of work leading up to that hearing really the bulk of the work of that investigative action? Or is it typically, or can it just be all over the place? Just depends on the...
It's all over the place. If somebody gives you 2 weeks to put a hearing together, which happens, you spend 95% of your time. You find the talking heads that are going to be there. There's no time for you to do any original research at all. You're just putting it together. If they give you 2 months, then it might be, you'd spend 70% of your time on the investigation. For Center 11, we would spend 80 or 90% of our time on the actual investigation because we were doing in-depth, complex, factual matters. And then, 10 to 20, I'd say 10% on the hearing itself.
Great. And in terms of the fact collection and prioritization step, or why don't we focus first on the prioritization? So you mentioned at the beginning of the year, you're already, or the beginning of the, at the beginning of the, I guess, committee.
Beginning of the year.
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, you're prioritizing certain investigative areas, shall we say. How are those prioritized, and how are those kind of linked to what you think is important for the general, economy, or for what's in the news? How do you come up with that prioritization in the beginning of the year?
Well, Jim, you were a senior staffer, so do you want to take that one?
Well, I think this, Matt, your question really raises a bigger question, because what we've been talking about the last few minutes have been in-depth congressional investigations by oversight committees dedicated to investigations. But as far as, oversight, as I mentioned at the outset, can be both more focused on kind of routine matters where, the legislature or Congress are really, keeping tabs on the execution of the law, as opposed to hot button issues that necessarily are going to drive, a demand for an investigation. So we're really talking about that both of these kinds of oversight occur, and they're both very important to the system. But you need to understand that distinction from the outset. So I think, if the question is about sort of hot button issues, and you might prioritize those depending on the jurisdiction of the committee and the wishes of the chair. The chair may say, well, these are the things I really think are very important for us to look into this year. Whereas if you're the education committee in the state of Michigan's Senate, let's say, or in California, the California Assembly's education committee, you may be more concerned about wanting to make sure that you're really keeping tabs on student debt, or you're keeping tabs on the oversight of charter schools, for example, which are a growing phenomenon around many states. Are we really making sure that these sort of non-traditional schools are being held to the same kind of standards and the same kind of accountability and transparency that traditional public schools are being held to? So these are kind of different kinds of questions, and you might allocate your resources differently depending on the kind of oversight you're doing.
Well, the one thing I'd add to that is it depends a lot on your boss. Your boss during an election may make certain promises or announce certain interests and get elected on that basis. So they want to look at that stuff. If they cared about traffic, they want to look at, how we handle traffic issues, what the government is doing, what sort of support, what kind of spending we're doing. On the other hand, you might be investigating what your boss told you to, and all of a sudden Enron happens. So that actually happened. Levin said, drop everything, we're doing Enron for the next year. So.
Well, let's talk more about the kind of systematic oversight of the executive branch. Maybe Jim, can you talk a little bit further about how that happens? You know, is it relatively uniform across all the committees or individuals, or is it a highly variable, you know, ad hoc approach depending upon the committee and its jurisdiction over the executive branch? How does that kind of routine oversight typically happen?
Well, I think it really does vary all over the map. Depending on, if you're speaking of Congress, it's going to depend on the committee and its jurisdiction over the various aspects of the law, you know, of the many, you know, government programs and, you know, departments and agencies that have been set up by law and then are supposed to be under the jurisdiction of those congressional committees. You know, I think the priority is often going to be, well, we have a way in which we think about it when we are training, you know, congressional staff or state staff, or we're advocating for what we think is the best approach. And I'd like to speak of it in terms of a cycle, right? You know, the act of legislating is really a problem, you know, problem identification, and then, you know, hopefully a solution to that problem. But really, oversight and legislating more broadly is really a cycle where you identify a problem, you investigate that problem, fashion a point of view about the facts in a report and some recommendations that then hopefully leads to legislation that gets signed by the president. But that isn't the end of the story, of course, right? In good government and in a democracy, those same lawmakers should be conducting oversight of the federal agencies that are supposed to be executing these programs. You know, let's say it's affordable housing is your concern, right? Well, you know, we've done many things over the last, say, 60 years to try to address the issues of affordable housing and fair housing. And some of those programs have been very effective. Some of them have not been effective. And so it's really the job of these congressional committees, the ones that deal with housing, first, let's say, to follow up and investigate and hold hearings and talk to experts, but also listen to communities about whether these programs are really working on the ground. And ultimately, that should lead to another round of reports and then perhaps additional legislation to correct, you know, a mid-course correction, if you will, to make sure these programs are really keeping their promises.
I want to dig a little bit more into this concept that you mentioned about the problem and then solution framework and thinking about oversight. You know, you have these committees, they have their oversight responsibilities, and, you know, according to that framework, the first step is to identify problems, right? How are they identifying, or maybe a better question is, how should they be identifying these kinds of problems? Are they, you know, looking at reports regularly that are coming out of the executive branch? Are they watching the news? Are they interviewing, you know, disgruntled staff from the executive branch? How are they kind of getting a picture of how the law is really being executed by the executive branch?
Well, I want Elise to give her experience and perspective on this, but I would just say at the outset that you know, the act, really, the Congress and state legislatures as well operate in what I call an oversight ecosystem, right? That ecosystem includes obviously the executive branch and its willingness to share information and be transparent. It also includes the media. And a lot of times oversight committees or committees of general jurisdiction will be triggered by something they see, an expose that they read about in a newspaper or a magazine or something. And then the third piece of that is the public. The public, you know, will often bring concerns to a legislator's office or to a congressional office. And so those three things have got to be working together. And one of the things we've encountered in recent years, for example, is a real decline in the capacity of local and regional media. There are not as many reporters covering these issues. covering state capitals, doing, investigative journalism that often is sort of the original inspiration for a lot of oversight.
I'd like to add to that in terms of the executive branch. Congress has enacted a law to have an inspector general in 72 different agencies. And the objective of that inspector general, we call him an IG, is to look at waste, fraud, and abuse within the agency and to identify problems. So another source of oversight for the Congress is to look at what reports the IG is putting out. We also have something called the Government Accountability Office that also looks at a whole range of things. All they're supposed to do is look at things that they think Congress will be interested in. Agencies themselves often issue reports that will trigger oversight. And as Jim mentioned, the public, including civil society and trade associations and industry groups, will identify problems, issue a report, and try to get Congress to look at a particular problem. So there's always a lot more problems than you can possibly pick. And as you said, it's all about selecting priorities. And that's just, there's no uniform way. We need better research to understand how people select what they do and how should they make their selections.
Right. I guess you can see whether the executive is faithfully acting on the law, right, and implementing the law. And on the other side, as you mentioned, also Jim, is the idea that, well, maybe the program isn't meeting its original goals, right, and it doesn't matter how well it's executed. There might be some flaw in the logic behind that program. Obviously there are groups that are thinking about this exclusively, this problem, but how do you look at it through this lens of oversight? How looking at program success or failure, is that part of the oversight process? And how do you see that as feeding into the prioritization?
Well, if I can give you just an example, Senator Coburn from Oklahoma was a doctor before he became a member of Congress. And he looked at Social Security disability programs, and he felt there was enormous amounts of fraud in it, that the people who were getting money were just not disabled and taking money away from the people who really were disabled, and the program itself was heading towards running out of money. Now, he came to our staff and said that's what he wanted to look at. He was in the minority at the time. I have to say I was a skeptic about whether there really was a lot of fraud. But they started doing a factual investigation, and boy, were they right, and I was wrong. There was an enormous amount of fraud going on, and they proved it. So, it depends on the interest of the member, how much time and resource they want to devote to it, and whether they're on a committee or subcommittee that has that within their jurisdiction so they can take an in-depth look. And of course, as Jim was saying, there's all this day-to-day stuff. Suppose you have a veterans hospital in your district, and there's a lot of complaints coming from your constituents that they have a long waiting list or they have very substandard, health care. Well, then you might, as a member of Congress, try to look at that yourself or try to get a subcommittee or committee interested in taking a look at that hospital within your district. So things come up in all different kinds of ways.
I would just add, another kind of layer of nuance and maybe complexity to this is that, we have a federal system, and, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution basically allocates most of the power in our society to the states and the people. And so a lot of federal activity, a lot of congressional programs really are programs that hand perhaps a lot of money and maybe some authority off to the states, and then the states implement a lot of these things. And one thing that needs to be, focused on is how well we're really understanding this handoff between the federal government and the states. And I'll give you one example that we're doing research on right now with our Levin Center research scholar, a political scientist named Kristen Taylor. She is looking at disaster response. So we all are familiar with the hurricanes and the fires and the tornadoes and all these extreme events that are occurring that cause a great deal of damage. And what she's found in her research is that the federal government, which has FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management agency that provides a lot of money and a lot of support. A lot of that money is going into states. The states are taking that money and they tend to focus very much on just, and understandably, delivering immediate help to people who've lost, lost property, suffered terrible tragedy as a result of these horrible events. But the problem is that what also ought to be happening is there should be a lot of focus and money spent on mitigating the damage caused by these natural disasters. We can do things to make the next hurricane or the next flood or the next wildfire much less damaging and much less dangerous to human life and property. But we've got to do that stuff. And what she's finding in her research is that states tend to game the system, and they tend to work and provide most of the funding and most of the effort toward just, helping people recover. And so working these things and understanding these things from both a state and a federal perspective is very important. And oversight needs to be done in such a way that takes into account the fact that a lot of things that Congress does, it does through the states.
Well, maybe we can turn a little bit to the different kinds of work and research that the Levin Center is looking to either execute or encourage others to execute, since it seems this is an under-investigated area. Can you talk more about, what is the Levin Center? What are your research priorities? What questions do you feel like need to be answered and investigated by others? And how are you going about doing that?
Sure. I thought maybe we would talk about it in terms of work we're doing sort of at the congressional level and then work we're doing at the state level. Elise, do you want to talk a bit about what we're doing at the congressional level?
Sure. So as you said, Matt, there is very little research done in the oversight area, even though it has such an important role to play in terms of good government and the checks and balances envisioned by the Constitution. So the first thing we've done is just try to get more academic interest. So we've started an oversight scholars listserv. We started off with about 20 people. Now we're up to 170 scholars across the country. And another thing we've done is just built a library of the research that already exists, so people don't reinvent the wheel and they know what there is. And what's really sad is that there's such a small number of papers that we're able to assemble those fairly easily. And we're now trying to encourage more people to add to that base of knowledge. We also started a cash award. We pay now $1,000 a year cash award for the best research paper in the oversight field. And we create a lot of conferences. We try to identify issues to generate interest. For example, we had a conference this past year looking at science and technology issues. Congress doesn't do a very good job when it comes to understanding those sort of complicated issues. And we're trying to understand why it doesn't do a good job and what could it do better. For example, it doesn't have a level of expertise needed on the staff level. Another issue we looked at is how does Congress overlook classified programs at the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community, and what are the issues involved in that oversight area? So gathering the research, trying to encourage better research, and holding these conferences are what we're doing on the congressional level. Jim, you want to talk about our state efforts?
Sure. Our state efforts are similar in the sense that we're doing a lot of the same things, looking also at these same questions with regard to state oversight. But I would just cite a couple of things that are really exciting and really first of their kind. One of them is we commissioned a study to look at all 50 states and the legislative oversight that takes place in all of these states. And we now have a website, including a map that you can go to where you can select the state you're interested in, click on that part of the map, and then you'll see a detailed report of how that state conducts oversight, how its legislature uses the power it has to gather information and hold the executive branch accountable and look into issues of importance to people in that state. One area we're particularly focusing on this year is oversight of government contracting. So as I mentioned before, the federal government often does its work through the states. And one of the great examples of that is the response to the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout from that. A lot of the money that is flowing from the federal government is flowing to states. And a lot of that money is then flowing to private contractors. Well, who is taking a look at whether those contracts are valid, whether there is a really solid procurement process, competitive bidding, all the things that you'd want to see in a purchasing operation? Are those things really happening at the state level? Are we overseeing those things? So we'll be coming out with reports about that, looking at states that are doing a pretty good job of oversight, but could be doing better, as well as looking at some specific examples, case studies of where states have found problems in contracting in response to the COVID crisis and what they've done about it. Another thing we do, and this is really for research at both the state and the federal level, is that we have what we call Levin Center scholars, and Kristen Taylor is one of the scholars that we are now funding. And those are academic researchers. They can be law professors or political scientists or other people in academia who are investigating issues on the cutting edge of our understanding of how oversight is working. And what we are trying to do there is, we're trying to learn about what's the sort of cutting edge of research and expand our understanding of how oversight is working, where it's not working, and so on. And then also bring that understanding out to the field and help researchers as well as practitioners, people doing this in Congress and doing it in state capitals around the country, do a better job, have better tools with which to conduct oversight.
If I can just mention one panel that we have coming up on October 29th, we're looking at congressional oversight of the digital marketplace, Amazon, Facebook, all of those guys. And what we found is we had an academic just look at the congressional hearings. And to my great surprise, over the last 5 years, she found over 50 congressional hearings. I was very surprised at that. And she categorized them into looking at competitiveness issues, at disinformation issues, and privacy issues. And I don't think anyone has done that research before, just to find out what Congress is doing, and then to take the next step. Well, what did they look at? What are they recommending? Was it good oversight? Was it effective? Who were they listening to? Who are the leaders in Congress on those issues? So that's the kind of thing we're trying to encourage and also make more visible.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the makeup of the teams that are doing these investigations and oversight. And you mentioned that, typically there'll be someone who's been around for a while and knows how to do the investigation and knows the ropes and the process. And then there will be a lot of quite junior people executing a lot of that work. Is any of your research looking at what resources do these investigations really need to effectively do the job? Obviously they would seem to have an outsized impact on either return on investment for the American people if you find fraud and abuse, or industry regulation can have a huge cost or benefit associated with that. And yet these investigations seem to be done by relatively inexperienced junior staffers. So tell me about what you think, or maybe tell me about how are they staffed today, maybe even at the state level, and how do you think they should be staffed, or how they should be looked at from a budgetary or resource point of view?
Well, I think those are excellent questions. I don't know, Elise, do you want to amplify at all about what you said about how the staffing works? I can certainly comment on both the congressional side and the state side. I would just say, Matt, the challenges are very significant, and there is work going on with a number of good government groups to try to address this issue of congressional staff capacity. The Levin Center was privileged to be part of an effort to help a committee in Congress called the Modernization of Congress, a committee of the House of Representatives that was formed to try to update and modernize how the House of Representatives operates. And among the many recommendations that were put forward, they included, increasing the amount of money devoted to investigations, finding ways to raise staff salaries because they have not kept up with any kind of reasonable inflation factor, and really working on ways to help staff people get access to expertise outside of Congress. There is some really, really good work going on to create digital tools that will allow staff members to tap into networks of scientists outside of Congress when an issue arises, and help those staff people gain access to their scholarship and also access to them to come and present testimony and bring more expertise. At the state level, the problem is even more severe, because oftentimes state legislatures are not as well staffed. Oftentimes they are part-time. In many states, the state legislature operates part-time. And then you've got term limits, which are a really big problem, even in full-time legislatures. And I served in the Michigan House, which was a full-time legislature with a very good staff and great resources, really, in a lot of ways. But it was a term-limited legislature. And so oversight, is something, that cycle I talked about is a long-term cycle, right? It can take a number of years for you to really understand whether a program is working, whether these problems that you've identified are really being solved. And if you're going to be termed out and moving on to another position or out of government altogether, it's very hard for people to have the staying power to really see that oversight through.
I'll just add to that, one of the obvious big problems is a lack of training. The people that go to Congress, these new inexperienced hires, they're usually smart as a whip. They are from fantastic schools. They are eager, high energy, just devoted to working around the clock and on the weekends. People think government work 9 to 5. That was not my experience. We work pretty much 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And so you have people that are really eager to do this work, but still a young person is a young person. And so there isn't sufficient training. There isn't a way. We used to have an Office of Technology Assessment. So whenever you had a complex technology issue, you had nonpartisan experts not representing anybody from any particular viewpoint to give you help. We still have the Congressional Research Service. We have the Government Accountability Office. We have the IGs. There are a lot of places to go. And I found in Congress, anybody will talk to you to educate you. So you can do that. But another big problem is the pace in Congress. A lot of members of Congress, they want to have a hearing every week. Well, if you have a hearing every week, every hearing looks at the most surface level issues and moves on without trying to do anything about it. And Senator Levin's mode was fewer issues and greater depth. So that's another big issue that affects how the staff operates.
You bring up a point that I'm curious about in relation to full-time staff in Congress to execute a lot of this work versus using contractors or something else. When you look at the data from Congress, you see a lot of consultants or outside parties that can be paid to do ongoing work and support what's happening internally. But then Congress doesn't have to necessarily take on that full-time staff. Is that at all
Congress
effective, or is
doesn't have
that
any money
something
to pay
that
its own.
doesn't make sense from your experience?
Well, the problem is Congress doesn't have money for its own staff. It has no money for consultants. And there are a lot of ethics issues that preclude you from getting free help. So for example, you want to go to a law firm, some guy's been studying it for years, or some scientist, you have to be very careful not to violate the gift rules, because you can't volunteer your time unless that person is going to be a witness. So that gets into, you're not even at the witness stage. So can you do it for educational purposes? There's a whole minefield out there about using outside parties. But even so, we tried to hire a contractor every once in a while. But I mean, it was just pathetic what we could pay them. People don't devote money to Congress, and they don't devote money to oversight, even though there's an enormous payback for the oversight that you do. And I think it's a miscalculation as to where we put our resources. When we try to get people interested in oversight, their eyes sort of glaze over and they're like, oversight, forget it. And yet, if you want a government that works well, oversight's the name of the game.
Well, I wonder, it goes back to my question earlier about the resources dedicated to oversight and whether what's the framework that you would use to identify what the appropriate budget would be? If I spend $100 on something, maybe I'm willing to spend $1 to make sure that that $99 is well spent.
Well, we're paying pennies on the dollar. I mean, at PSI, I think we had about $1 million a year. Our staff was never bigger than 10 people. And for example, in the financial crisis, on the other side of us was Goldman Sachs, Washington Mutual, not to mention all the agencies that we were looking at, the credit rating agencies. So we're dealing with lawyers who are getting paid thousands of dollars an hour, and like 8 of them would show up for an interview. And then there's me and like 3 staff people. So, you know, it's a real disparity. Now, to its credit, Congress does amazing work with the very little resources it has. But, you know, Congress often doesn't value Congress or their state legislature. And I think they ought to, because they actually get a lot out of those oversight efforts.
So that's part of what
we could do is get some research showing the payback for what it costs versus what the results are. I don't know of any research like that. That would be a wonderful area to look at.
Yeah, I mean, really, Matt, to boil this down, we don't know enough to answer that question really credibly. You know, what is the right amount of or proportion, you know, that we should be spending when we authorize a program. But one thing we should be doing, and one thing we're hoping to do over time, is that legislation as it's being drafted and programs as they're being designed should be designed in such a way that has oversight in mind. So not only sort of the cost of it, but also just sort of the notion that we should be setting up programs so that they are transparent and so they're generating data that can allow us 5 years or 10 years down the road to look at them and see if they're really working. And, you know, if we had better research, we could figure out maybe what's the right budget for that.
And we've actually done a little bit of that after the financial crisis. There was a stimulus program, and oversight was built into it so that you had to report every dollar, where it went, how much, all of that on a public database. People have been trying to get that for the COVID-related assistance as well, but there's been massive resistance by the executive branch. They don't want to say who they're giving the money to. They don't want to say how much. They don't want to say what the circumstances are. So even though there are some requirements in the law, the executive branch just refuses to disclose the information, making oversight very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting area to investigate, building in oversight mechanisms within, you know, the legislation. And that also overlaps a bit with some of the work that Sunwater is doing around sunset provisions.
Yes, that's a great oversight forcing mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah, we find the state of South Carolina is a really good example. They have very rigorous sunsetting provisions in many of their laws in South Carolina. And the Oversight Committee in the South Carolina House has an amazing process where they set a plan every year to look and to study a certain group of programs that are up for renewal, you know, in the coming years. And they do a really great work of surveying and gathering feedback, not just from government agency staff, but also from the public, from the people who, you know, who are living these programs, to get information back so they can evaluate whether there's really the bang for the buck, you know, whether this program is really living up to its promises.
Great. Well, if there's anything else you want to mention about oversight, well, I think we're coming to our lightning round of questions that are universal among our interviewees. So anything on the oversight thing you'd like to discuss before we move on to those questions?
I think we're ready for the lightning round.
Sure. We're ready.
All right. Awesome. So my first question is the concept of representation in Congress. Congress is elected to represent their constituents. What does that mean? Or what should it mean, I should say?
Well, I think it really goes back to something we talked about earlier a bit, which is this idea that representing people representing, you know, the public in Congress is really about a cycle of identifying problems, investigating those problems, legislating solutions to those problems, and then following up and conducting oversight to make sure that the promises you made in writing that legislation are actually being kept, and that the executive branch, which is charged with faithfully carrying out that legislation, is doing its job. And to do that properly, you have to be thinking not just about listening to the agencies and the talking heads and the pundits and the experts in the Capitol, but also listening to people at home, listening to people in our communities, especially people who are not as, who are more at risk and isolated, and finding ways to hear their voices, so that, because oftentimes they're the ones who have the most to lose if government fails.
Elise?
Well, I would just say that we need research into good mechanisms, better mechanisms to have that sort of dialogue go on. How do you find out what your constituents think? How do you do it in an effective, efficient way? And there are people working on that problem, but there isn't, again, very much research that looks at what works and what doesn't.
All right, next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? Jim?
Well, Elise, why don't you go first? I think you have some thoughts about kind of the responsibilities of Congress and how they should be allocated in your experience.
Well, Congress is assigned a lot of obligations by the Constitution. You have to do legislation, you have to approve nominations, you have to figure out spending, military action. There's a lot of stuff that Congress ought to do. And as Jim said earlier, you've got a cycle of things that is involved in that. You want informed decision making. If you're going to do any of those things, you need some facts, or at least you hope people are working from facts when they make decisions about legislation, nominations, etc. So what do I think they should be spending their time on? Oversight. Oversight has to be part of that process. And in fact, when the Congressional Management Foundation came up with a description of congressional leaders, what should they be doing on the job, they came up with 7 different things. And number 3 was oversight. So that's what we really focused on. And I would say, they should spend 20–30% of their time on oversight.
It's a little bit like, Matt, it's a little bit like the old saying you probably heard from, your older relatives. I know we all heard this, spend more time listening than talking. Well, Congress should be spending more time listening, conducting oversight. And then maybe when they do talk, they might have something a little more profound, maybe a little more informative to say. And when they legislate, the outcomes might be a little bit better.
So do you agree with Elise's 20–30% of the time on oversight?
At least. Yeah, I would say that's a minimum.
Spent more like 80% of the time. So it may depend on the member and what subcommittee they're on. So he was higher than the average, which was a good thing.
Great. All right, so my next question is not directly related to oversight, obviously. So how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Well, I think even though it's this, one of the things that we like to say at the Levin Center is that even though we work on oversight and we that's our focus, that really the values that we're talking about, the idea of bipartisan or fact-finding, that isn't captive to partisan interests and partisan, values, is really something that ought to carry over into everything that members of Congress do. You really should be looking for views that come from other places. You shouldn't be, the biggest problem we have these days in our political society is that too many people are operating in an echo chamber, and the only input they're getting is reinforcing what they already believe. And to make good public policy and really frankly to represent your entire district, you've got to take it on yourself to be willing to listen to other people who fundamentally disagree with you. Doesn't mean you have to meet them in the middle. That isn't necessarily the goal, but the goal should be to be open to other people's points of view, because at the end of the day, you really end up with a better understanding of reality if you're willing to listen to other people. So I would say that would be if I could do anything, it would be to foster that kind of attitude that people are willing to listen to folks who don't agree with them.
So just to kind of poke you a little bit more on that. So you really what you're talking about there is more about Congress listening to its constituents that they don't necessarily agree with. What about congressmen in relationship to other congressmen or senators? How should they dialogue?
Same thing, I'd say. They need to talk to, you have members of Congress with diametrically opposed views, and they need more settings, social and otherwise, where they can actually talk to each other, where they're not trying to get something done, but to understand what the issues are. And I'll just give you one other completely different thing since we're talking about debate. In oversight hearings and all hearings in the House, they have a 5-minute rule. Each member is only given 5 minutes to ask questions. Well, we've all seen the result of that. It's embarrassing. You have senators trying to rush through what they're asking. They're almost berating the witnesses when they have to cut you off there. Why don't we change the rules? There was a recent House hearing where each side was given 45 minutes to begin an oversight hearing. That allowed them to develop the themes, talk about details in a more relaxed, coherent way. So we need to change some of those technical rules, as well as, you know, the sort of larger issue of actually talking to each other.
Great. So let's move on to the next one. What book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I have to say, there's really been not nearly enough written about the topics that we've been talking about. So I can't really cite a specific book or article. I mean, we need more research and more analysis of these issues. Oversight is an area where there's some emerging work being done, but it's a new field really, and there's a lot more investigation and research that needs to be done.
I would agree. I mean, there was no training when I was doing investigations for Senator Levin. I read old committee reports. I read hearing records to try to learn what I was supposed to do. I had a terrific mentor, Linda Gustitis, who helped me along the way. And that's why, since I've retired, I've spent so much of my time doing training exercises. One of the things the Levin Center does, along with a couple of other organizations, the Lugar Center and the Project on Government Oversight, we have boot camps twice a year. And we take staff from the House and the Senate, Democrats, Republicans, we put them on bicameral, bipartisan teams. We give them fake scandals. And then over a 2-day period, we take them through the investigative process to just kind of help them think about the process in a holistic way and how one part affects the other. But you know, there isn't very much to read on that. We're actually trying to generate information on that. I wrote a book called Financial Exposure that was all about Senator Levin's techniques and the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. People believe nobody's ever done fact-based bipartisan investigations that matter. And in fact, for 15 years, that's exactly what we did. It's not pie in the sky, totally feasible. We did it. And I had to write it down before that entire history would sort of blow away in the wind.
Right. Well, let me move on to my last question here, which is the plans. You know, we've talked about short-term, what you're working on and what you're trying to achieve. If we look out longer term for the Levin Center and for the research that you in the ecosystem you hope to build up, can you tell me a little bit more about the long term, where you're trying to go with everything? If we look 10, 20 years out.
Well, I'll take a stab at that from the outset here. We really want to, we envision a future in which lawmakers and the public they serve really have a different idea about the job of a lawmaker, that it really encompasses a great deal more fact-finding and listening than we see today, and that those lawmakers and the institutions they work in, whether that's in Congress or in state capitals, are resourced in such a way that they can do that job. And we're not talking about, gold plating, the halls of Congress or spending tons of money. It wouldn't cost very much to properly equip our Congress and our state capitals with the ability to do really good oversight and do it in a way that's not captive to partisan interests. It's being done. I think Elise's point is very well taken. It's being done in some places, but the public doesn't necessarily know about it. The public doesn't demand it. And so our long-term goal here is to create a center in Detroit and in Washington, our satellite office, to really communicate this to the legislatures and to the public that this is possible, and here's how you do it, and here is how it's being done. So we do that through research and through advocacy, and where necessary, we help. We get involved in court battles when the executive branch refuses to comply with reasonable oversight requests.
I'll just add to that some of the more specifics. As Jim just said, we have an effort to do amicus briefs in litigation over congressional oversight authority. We are trying to develop a fellows program, a research fellows program, so that more research is done that tells us more about what does it mean to have good oversight. We're developing a civic education component where we work with high schoolers to try to tell them that oversight hearings are not supposed to be partisan, food fights. They're supposed to be exercises in bipartisan understanding of a particular problem. So we're trying to do it on a whole bunch of different scales. We're trying to encourage better training as well, so that members of Congress can do good oversight in a hearing and that staff can support them properly. So we got a whole range of things that we are working on.
And really, I would say, just to close, the long-term goal here is to really turn down the heat in the in our capital, in our national capital as well as our state capitals. Turn down the partisan heat when it comes to fact gathering, to try to get the focus back on and really make it better than it ever has been. The focus on listening to people and gathering information in a factual and in-depth way. And in so doing, build those relationships. This is what Senator Levin did over the course of his career. He could work with people like Senator Tom Coburn, who was really the most conservative member of the US Senate. And yet the two of them had a relationship that allowed them to work together on very important issues and get to the bottom and get to the truth about what was really happening, say in the disability program, or with Senator McCain. Again, another person who was quite a bit more conservative than Senator Levin, yet the two of them could work together on so many issues. And they weren't trying to meet in the middle, they were trying to coalesce around a set of facts. And it's that belief system and those sets of values about fair dealing between the parties that we know, obviously, we need very much to restore to our political culture. And so in the long run, we know this isn't going to happen overnight, but we believe that this work will lead us in that direction. And we very much appreciate this opportunity to share what we're doing with you and everybody you're talking to.
Right. Well, thank you, Jim and Elise, for joining us. Much appreciated. And all of the work that you're doing, links will be supplied below for people to follow up on. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.